September 19th, 1944. Eindhoven, the Netherlands. A German Oberst named Friedrich Köckling stood at the window of a commandeered farmhouse and listened. He had been listening for 3 minutes. Not to artillery, not to engines on the road, to something above him, something that had been there since dawn and showed no sign of stopping. He stepped outside and looked up. The sky was full of aircraft. Not fighters, not bombers, transport planes. Slow, fat, lumbering things that flew in loose formations and trailed colored parachutes behind them. Crates and bundles and pallets tumbling through the cold Dutch air and drifting down to the fields south of Nijmegen, where American and British airborne troops were fighting to hold the bridges the Operation Market Garden plan required. Köckling watched for a long time. He was not new to war. He had commanded on the Eastern Front, in Italy, in France. He understood air power. He understood bombing raids and fighter sweeps and close air support. What he was watching was none of those things. What he was watching was an army feeding itself from the sky in the middle of a battle with a precision and a volume that no German logistics officer could have replicated in 6 months of planning with 6 months of resources he no longer possessed. He turned to his adjutant and said something that the adjutant would write down that evening in his diary. He said, "That is what we cannot answer. Not the tanks, not the artillery. That." He pointed at the sky. Hold that thought. Because what Köckling was pointing at that morning above Eindhoven was not a weapon system. It was not a tactical innovation. It was the physical expression of a supply philosophy that the American military had built from scratch in less than 3 years. A philosophy so foreign to German logistics doctrine that even when German commanders saw it operating above their own positions in broad daylight, they had no framework to counter it. The aircraft he was watching was the C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the Douglas DC-3 commercial airliner. It had no guns. It had no bombs. It flew at 160 miles an hour, slow enough that a determined anti-aircraft crew could track it by eye. It had a cargo door and a reinforced floor and a crew of 3. And in the entire war, it would prove to be the single most consequential aircraft the United States produced. Not the B-17, not the P-51 Mustang, not the B-29. A cargo plane that had been hauling passengers between New York and Chicago in 1941. This is the story of why. To understand what the C-47 meant to the American Army, you first need to understand what the German Army's supply system looked like from the inside. In 1944, the Wehrmacht's logistics were a masterpiece of improvisation, built on a foundation that was crumbling. German supply doctrine was based on a simple hierarchy. Supplies moved by rail to Army-level depots. From there, motor transport carried them to division. From division, horse-drawn wagons carried them to regiment and battalion. At the end of the chain, men carried what was left on their backs. This system had worked brilliantly in 1940. When German advances were fast, the rail network was intact, and the supply lines were short. By 1944, every one of those conditions had reversed. The rail network in France was being destroyed systematically by Allied air power. Motor transport was being destroyed on the roads. The horse population had been bled white across 4 years of a 2-front war. And the supply lines were no longer 30 miles, they were 300. The result was a German army that was almost always hungry, almost always short of ammunition, and almost always running on a fuel reserve that measured in hours rather than days. Captured German soldiers in Normandy told interrogators that their units regularly went 2 and 3 days without resupply. Some described periods of combat where they were issued a fixed number of rounds per man and told to make them last. Artillery batteries on the Siegfried Line in late 1944 operated under standing orders that limited them to a specific number of shells per day, regardless of what was happening in front of them. The shells were rationed the way doctors rationed morphine. This was not a failure of German engineering or German will. It was a failure of capacity, of infrastructure, of the fundamental arithmetic of moving mass across distance faster than an enemy can destroy the routes you're using. Now hold that arithmetic in your mind, because the American Army had solved the same problem with a completely different answer. And the answer had wings. The Douglas DC-3 had entered commercial service in 1936. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, 455 had been delivered to airlines across the world. It was the most successful commercial aircraft ever built. Reliable, rugged, capable of flying in weather that grounded other aircraft. Mechanics loved it because it forgave errors. Pilots loved it because it flew like it wanted to keep you alive. In early 1942, the United States Army Air Forces looked at the DC-3 and made a decision that would ripple through the rest of the war. They militarized it. They reinforced the floor to carry heavy cargo, widened the cargo door, added paratrooper anchor cables along the ceiling, and designated the result the C-47 Skytrain. Then they ordered 10,000 of them. Not 100, not 1,000. 10,000 aircraft built at a single Douglas factory in Long Beach, California, supplemented by a second production line in Oklahoma City. At peak production, one C-47 rolled off the line every 93 minutes. 93 minutes. The German Junkers Ju-52, the Wehrmacht's primary transport aircraft, a good airplane, reliable and proven, was being produced at roughly 500 per year by 1944. American factories were producing C-47s faster than that in a single month. But this is where the American story gets interesting, and where the German failure begins. Because building the aircraft was only the first part. The second part was building the system to use them. In November 1942, the United States Army Air Forces established the Air Transport Command. Its mission was not combat. It was not bombing. Its mission was to move things: fuel, food, blood, ammunition, spare parts, replacement soldiers, to wherever they were needed, faster than any surface route could manage. The ATC operated routes across the North Atlantic, across the South Atlantic, across the Pacific, across the Himalayas. That last route, the flight from India over the Himalayan mountains into China, what the crews called the hump, was one of the most dangerous regular flight operations in the history of aviation. Pilots flew overloaded C-47s and C-46s through some of the worst mountain weather on Earth, at altitudes that pushed the aircraft to its limits, navigating by dead reckoning over terrain where a forced landing meant death. Between 1942 and 1945, the hump route lost 509 aircraft. It delivered 650,000 tons of cargo. That number, 650,000 tons, over mountains, in weather, in aircraft that had been designed to carry passengers between American cities, is the number you need to hold on to. because it tells you something about what the American military had decided somewhere at the level of doctrine and culture and expectation about what a transport aircraft was for. In the German military, the Ju-52 was a transport in the way a truck is a transport. It moved things. It was managed, allocated, scheduled, protected. It was a resource to be conserved. When it was used in large numbers, Crete in 1941, Stalingrad in 1942, the losses were devastating, and the operations were treated as exceptional, as emergencies that consumed assets Germany could not replace. In the American military, the C-47 was a weapon, not in the sense that it shot back, in the sense that it was a delivery mechanism for combat power, and it was expected to be used until it wore out or was shot down, and then replaced with another one. The pilots who flew it were trained to accept risk the way infantry accepted risk, not recklessly, but professionally, as the cost of the job. This distinction is invisible on paper. It is devastating in practice. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Patton's Third Army was east of the city and moving fast, covering 30 miles a day, consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel every 24 hours. The surface supply system, the trucks running from the Normandy beaches east across France on what would become known as the Red Ball Express, was at its absolute limit. The roads were breaking down under the weight. The trucks were breaking down from the mileage. The fuel to run the trucks was itself consuming a significant portion of what the trucks were carrying. By September 2nd, Patton's tanks were running dry, not slowing down, stopping. 4 armored divisions, some of the most powerful ground forces in the world, sitting in fields east of Paris, unable to move because there was no fuel in their tanks. This is the moment the C-47 became a weapon. Within 72 hours, the Army Air Forces had converted 17 troop carrier groups, aircraft that had been delivering paratroopers during market garden planning, to emergency fuel haulers. They flew fuel forward in 5-gallon jerry cans packed into cargo nets. They landed on roads. They landed on fields. They landed on anything flat enough to stop a fully loaded aircraft without killing the crew. When there was no flat ground, they dropped the cans by parachute and let the ground crews sort out what survived the landing. It was not efficient. A jerry can dropped from 500 feet has a meaningful chance of being dented, split, or simply lost in a hedgerow. The waste rate on aerial supply was higher than ground transport in ideal conditions. Ideal conditions did not exist in September 1944. In 3 weeks of emergency aerial supply operations, American C-47s delivered enough fuel to keep Patton's advance alive. Not comfortable, not adequately supplied by any textbook standard, alive, moving, enough. The German army had no equivalent capability. When a German armored column ran out of fuel east of the Rhine in 1944, it stayed where it was. It did not call for an aerial resupply that could convert fighter escort groups to tankers in 72 hours. The option did not exist. The aircraft did not exist. The training did not exist. The doctrine did not exist. And this is where the deeper story lives. Not in the aircraft itself, but in the doctrine. The decision, made quietly in 1942 in planning documents most people have never read, that logistics was not a support function behind the combat army, but a combat function inside it. That moving supplies was as important as moving infantry, and that the men and machines doing the moving deserved the same resources, the same priority, and the same institutional commitment as the men and machines doing the fighting. The Germans never made that decision, or rather, they made the opposite decision, again and again across the entire war. At Stalingrad in 1942, when the Sixth Army was encircled, Goering promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped force by air. It could not. The Ju-52 fleet was insufficient, the crews were insufficiently trained for instrument flying in Russian winter, and the ground organization at the receiving end had never been designed for large-scale aerial resupply. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons per day to survive. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 94 tons per day, against a requirement of 700. 300,000 men died or walked into Soviet captivity because a supply system had been promised that did not exist, backed by an aircraft that was not built in sufficient numbers, flown by crews who had not been trained for the mission, to a force that had not been prepared to receive it. The Americans, watching that failure from the outside, drew a specific lesson. It was not that aerial resupply was impossible. It was that aerial resupply required infrastructure, trained crews, ground organization, standardized containers, maintenance systems capable of keeping aircraft flying at high tempo, and enough aircraft that losing some to weather or enemy action did not collapse the entire operation. They built all of it. By the autumn of 1944, the American air supply system had become something that had never existed before in the history of warfare. 300 C-47s could be loaded, launched, and conducting a supply drop over a contested drop zone within 48 hours of an order being given. The crews who flew them, many of them former commercial airline pilots, some of them men who had been flying DC-3s for Eastern Airlines or TWA 2 years earlier, had been trained not just to fly, but to navigate to specific coordinates under fire, at low altitude, at low speed, while being shot at by light anti-aircraft weapons, and to complete the drop before breaking away. This required a specific kind of courage. Not the courage of the fighter pilot, who is moving fast and can maneuver and can fight back. The courage of the C-47 pilot was closer to the courage of the combat engineer. You slow down, you hold the line, you complete the task. Then you see if you're still alive. At Bastogne, in December 1944, when the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by German armor and running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies in the worst winter in decades, it was C-47s that broke the siege from above before Patton's armor broke it from below. The drops happened in impossible weather. Cloud ceilings below 500 feet, visibility near zero, anti-aircraft guns ringing the perimeter. Pilots flew by instruments through cloud and came out below the ceiling and put the drops within the perimeter, then climbed back into the cloud and flew home. Some didn't make it home. In 5 days of aerial resupply to Bastogne, the Americans delivered 850 tons of supplies to a surrounded division. It was not enough. It was never enough during those days. But it kept the 101st fighting until the ground relief arrived. The Germans had tried to supply the Bastogne perimeter's attackers by road. The roads were interdicted by American fighter bombers whenever the weather cleared. The Germans moved at night in small convoys with headlights off, carrying a fraction of what their forces needed. The asymmetry was not in numbers, it was in system. Friedrich Kuckling survived the war. He was captured in April 1945 and spent 2 years in Allied captivity before being repatriated. After his release, he was interviewed by American military historians compiling the German manuscript program, a systematic effort to record German officers' understanding of why the war had gone as it did. The interviewers asked him many questions about tactics, about command decisions, about the failures of the high command. His answers on those subjects were detailed, precise, and often illuminating. But when the subject turned to logistics, he gave an answer shorter than all the others. He said the fundamental German error was the belief that fighting power was a product of training and will, that a well-trained, determined soldier could compensate for supply deficiencies through discipline and courage. He said the Americans had understood something Germany never accepted, that fighting power is a product of systems, that a soldier who has no ammunition is not a poorly supplied soldier. He is not a soldier at all. He is a man standing in a field. He said the C-47 represented, better than any other single thing, the American understanding of that principle. That an aircraft designed to carry civilians between American cities had been converted into a weapons delivery system not because of its speed or its armament, but because of its cargo. Because the Americans had grasped that the most dangerous thing you could fly over an enemy's position was not a bomb. It was a supply drop to the men fighting below. The last C-47 built under wartime contract rolled out of the Douglas plant in Long Beach in August 1945. By that point, 10,174 had been produced. Of those, 1,200 were lost in combat operations. The rest flew on. Many flew for decades. The aircraft was so well designed, so fundamentally sound, that militaries around the world operated C-47s into the 1990s. Some are still flying today. Douglas never built a replacement. No replacement was needed. The crews who flew them went home the way most of them went home, quietly, without ceremony. The pilots of the troop carrier groups were not fighter aces, so there were no tallies on their fuselages. They were not bomber crews, so there were no famous missions in the history books. They were drivers, professional drivers of the sky, who flew a slow aircraft through anti-aircraft fire and mountain weather and North Atlantic ice, because that was what the job required, and the job did not allow for the alternative. One of them, a captain named Robert Emmons from Dayton, Ohio, who flew 87 supply missions in the European theater between June 1944 and April 1945, gave a single interview to a local newspaper after his discharge. The reporter asked him what it had been like. Emmons thought for a moment and said he didn't know how to explain it to someone who hadn't been there. He said the missions felt less like flying than like driving a truck on a very bad road where people were occasionally trying to shoot you. He said the part he thought about most wasn't the combat or the weather or the close calls over the drop zones. It was the faces of the men on the ground when the supplies came down. The way they ran for the crates. The way a man looks when something he thought was gone, ammunition, food, morphine, replacement parts for a radio, suddenly drops out of the sky wrapped in a colored parachute. He said it looked like relief. He said it looked like the moment a man realizes he isn't going to die today after all. He went back to Ohio and opened a hardware store. Friedrich Kochling's adjutant, the man who had written down what his commander said above Eindhoven on September 19, 1944, "That is what we cannot answer," kept the diary for the rest of his life. After the war, he became a school teacher in Bavaria. He never published the diary. When he died in 1979, his son found it among his papers and donated it to the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, where it still sits. The entry for September 19, 1944 is 3 paragraphs. The last sentence reads, "The sky above us was full of them, and I understood then that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a country that had decided to move itself to wherever it was needed, and had found a way to do it that we had never imagined and could not stop.
He was a school teacher. He had never studied military history, but he had understood, watching those parachutes fall through the Dutch sky on a September morning, the thing that German generals with full staffs and years of education had failed to grasp. The Americans had not built a better army. They had built a better system. And the system could go wherever there was sky. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That's over 13 minutes of real history, and it means something that you're still here. If this reached you, if the men who flew slow planes through anti-aircraft fire and mountain weather deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. It's the single most effective thing you can do to help this story find the people who care about it. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell, and you will not miss the next one.
I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Leave it in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a father who never talked about it, or one who couldn't stop, tell us about them. These stories survive because people like you keep passing them forward. Thank you.